The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. We've just witnessed a presidential race in which both candidates claim to want to become the president for all, the entire nation, not just their supporters, but for everyone. And they also invoked God, one a little bit more, I think, than the other, but in the recent concession speech, the one candidate invoked God front and center as an American value by God at the very beginning of the speech and towards the end. And so the question we can ask for ourselves, though, because these candidates are very different, and because we're in a secular society, is what God? How is God defined in these speeches? And also, to what extent does this definition of God relate to all? Who is everyone? Or are some people excluded from this definition of all? And how does that relate to our biblical conception of God and who is all inclusive in his eyes? Well, our passage, our Old Testament reading, helps us to have some answers for these questions. It was the reading of Elijah who went to the woman of Zarephath, and there was a drought, and she gave him the last of her provisions. The drought caused a famine, and he asked her to give of the last of her oil and flour, in addition to a drink of water, but he promised that God would give through her. And so we see God's providence. Now, how does this relate to those opening questions that I had regarding who is God and who is all? Well, in order to understand this, it's important that we consider the background to this story. Now, the reason, well, we'll get to why there's a reason for the drought in just a second here. But the circumstances were that the king of that time was Ahab, and Ahab had taken for himself his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. And then what Ahab went and did is he served Baal and worshiped him, the god of the Sidonians. Ahab was a very multicultural king, and so he was very open to these other cultures and introduced them to the God of Israel. Now, actually, if we go forward beyond our gospel reading, we see that not only did he worship the god of Baal, he had a number of prophets of Baal on the government payroll going around, and in fact, that became really the dominant religion of Israel at that time. Yes, we have the God of Israel, but we also worship Baal now. And that was from top down. Now, to understand a little bit also about the god of Baal is that the god of Baal was a fertility god and the god of rain. So rain is rain coming down from the clouds. And so as a fertility god, the symbol of fertility, and you can see this in the Bible Museum down in D.C., were phallic symbols. So you get the idea. The god of fertility, but really the god of sexuality. Everything goes. Right? And by being the god of rain, and there are no reservoirs, not like we have today, and so the rain was essential for productive land. He was the god of the economy. So this is sounding a little bit like something that we see today, much like our secular scenario in which the God, so to speak, of the land says that, look, everything goes. We're not going to exclude people based on their sexuality. This is a good thing. It's front and center now. And also the economy is really important. And so that rings a little bit similar to our current recent election scenario. The economy was the deciding factor. And also, interestingly enough, Baal was a god in which people sacrificed their young. And Jeremiah 19:5 and other verses similar to that we read that, look what you did, Israel. You went and sacrificed your young sons on the altar, something that I never commanded you to do. So, some of you might be thinking, I think I know where our Father is going with this. He's finally giving us a pardoned political homily. But actually, we'll find that there's not as many immediate parallels as you might think. We could have a lot of fun with this and find more parallels, but they do start to become limited because, well, let me just share about this in a moment, but understand this too. Underneath it all is that this was a theocracy. And so there's not a similar one-to-one correlation with our current nation. As a theocracy, we're looking at the God of Israel. And if you remember from the message last week, or if you know the kingdom of God is not limited to a particular land. The God of Israel extends beyond any particular nation. And that was believed in the Old Testament as well, although it wasn't how the God of Israel was typically experienced. He is front and center. And so you can imagine, though, that even though Ahab instituted this Baal worship along with the God of Israel, his multiculturalism as the God of the day, of the land, there were dissenters. And so there were dissenters among the people of God, and they wore hats that were called MAGA hats. You know, Make Israel Great Again. Now, I told you there's not too many parallels here because there's no political opposition. so they didn't do any good. All right, so the only one who was really the hope of Israel was Elijah, and he was a prophet. And so, as a prophet, his life was very important. And so we focus and we zero in on how his life was sustained. Now, in order to preserve his life, God sends him to, as we read in our Old Testament reading today, God tells him, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you." Zarephath, the god of Sidon. Now, Sidon was where Jezebel came from. They all worship Baal there. So it might be interesting that God wanted to feed him from a poor widow, but aren't there poor widows in Israel he could go to? Why to a Baal-worshiping widow in Sidon? And so you can imagine Elijah going there tentatively. Like, really, God? But then when he approaches, you can imagine her also saying, "Really, Baal? Why do I have this guy coming to me, of all people, to come and visit me today?" I mean, the God of Israel was so the previous century BC. And besides, he was wearing clothes that were so out of style. Elijah wore strange clothes. And so she wouldn't have been so appreciative of him either. He was marginalized in her eyes. She was marginalized in his eyes. And this brings us to the biblical concept of intersectionality. Now, you're familiar with this term, or you've heard it, and what it refers to, if you don't have a ready definition for it. It refers to those who are in marginalized groups. This is part of our current DEI culture. It undergirds it. That those who are in divergent, marginalized groups, even though they have very little in common, if they're marginalized, they have that in common. And so there's this intersection, and they need to band together in order to have more strength against the powers that be. The term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. But this biblical concept is a little bit different than the concept that we see in our current day. For example, it's called DEI. I wonder why it's DEI and not DIE. Well, the reason why I asked that is because just after 1989, when we were in college, just over 30 years ago, my wife Abby was in a class, and the professor said, "I think we need to throw Christians to the lions again." She was a little bit upset by this, and so she went to the dean and said, "Do you know this kind of language is going on in class?" And he said, well, by the way, because she knows that if this were said of any other marginalized group, and you can imagine the various ones that would exist on campus, similar to the ones that are identified as marginalized today, that professor would have been immediately fired. She didn't seek this. She wasn't trying to cause this professor to be fired, but isn't this a little inconsistent? And so the dean said to her, well, she can say that because you're in the power group. Well, not on this campus. The Christian fellowship consisted of all of 12 people. It was one of the most, marginalized, probably the most marginalized group on that campus. Fast forward to today, where Christianity is no longer the dominant religion of our land. It's the secular religion, so to speak. The religion that has so much in common with the worship of the god of Baal that I described earlier. But it's interesting, though, if you go on college campuses today, actually the environment is not always quite as hostile as it was 30 years ago. And there's a reason for this. It's because students now have been so removed from our Christian past, when this was considered at least nominally a Christian country, that they don't know the faith. So they aren't as biased against Christians as they were back then. They've got a blank slate. But they do have a question. They want to know, all right, we're interested in spirituality, some kind of spirituality. Secularism on its own is falling out of favor. But the question is the God of the Bible good? And it's not an unreasonable question, because so much of what they read about those who adhered to the biblical God had what Paul described to Timothy as a form of godliness but denying the substance thereof. What does that look like? So there are some who seem very pious on Sunday morning, but they've read about those same people going off and joining the Ku Klux Klan. And so we have seen people who, in the name of the biblical God, become very condemnatory to those who are on the margins. That is simply a part of our history in our nation and elsewhere. But there's also others who overreact to that, like a ditch on the other side of the road, and say, oh, we're so tired of that condemnatory talk, let's just throw it all out. Just go towards license and instead of that legalism. But then they adopt secular values, and so these students look at these types of Christians and they say, why should I go to church if the values are no different than when I get anywhere else in the world? Two different ways, a form of godliness but denying the substance thereof. So I've just introduced another concept here in our effort to define who is God and who is included in all, from a biblical perspective. There are some who, with a legalistic perspective, exclude others, but then there's some who try to include everyone in some way, and then who is God anyway? Does he have any definition at all? Bear with me, and we'll pull these threads together in just a moment. Now, one other thing that's worth pointing out here is that the story continues. And it's very important to really understand why Elijah went to the woman of Zarephath in the first place. We've learned something about God, that God is willing to provide from the poor. He gives us a more biblical idea of intersectionality with these two marginalized people coming together. But there's more to this story in just a moment, so bear with me. But just to close this middle section, notice what's different about this intersectionality, these two marginalized. You have one from the old guard who is being helped from one who has now gained favor. The tables were turned in Israel. But so often in our current society, those who are in the old guard, they're out, which is what Abby experienced in her college classroom. But here you have the marginalized from the old guard and the new, finding common ground in a God who provided for them in their poverty. But we haven't heard enough about the character of God, which is why we need to read further. Because the child dies. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill, and his illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, what have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son. So notice here that she doesn't say she hasn't sinned, but she wants to know, do you represent a condemnatory God? Is that what's happened here? And initially, Elijah has no answer for this. He goes to the Lord and said, O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn? Is it because of her sin? He doesn't say she hasn't sinned. He doesn't suggest that there aren't consequences for her sin. And so there is a definition to God. There is a sense of morality, of absolute truth, of right or wrong, all right, which is in some ways absent from the kind of secular religion that we've experienced over the last few decades. But also understand that this child is very important, okay? Now, without wanting to push this very far, there's a sense about, are children included in the all? Because there are some who say, we want the rights of all peoples, except for those who are in the womb, who have a different DNA and a different makeup than the body that encloses that person. So, who are the rights? Who speaks up for that child? Well, this is a very young child. Elijah is able to carry this child into the upper room where he calls upon God. And so here, there's no dichotomy between care for the woman and care for the child. Why do we need to argue between the both, right? You can care for each. He cares for the widow, the woman in her distress, and God provides for the child also. This helps us to get a little more clarity, again, who is included in the all. Both the old guard and the new, both the woman and the child. But then, to understand the character of God, Elijah stretches out himself over the child. And so, 3 times he does this. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber. And he said, then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord, O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again. Now, as a very good commentator noted, that when you stretch yourself out, you make yourself vulnerable, as opposed to when you close yourself in. If what you do with your body has a lot to do with how the state of your soul. If you've ever made yourself cruciform on the floor in a great need and cry out to God, you're basically saying, God, I give you my life. And so he makes himself vulnerable. He lays down his life for this child. And as if to say, God, I would rather die instead of him. He's willing to pour out his life upon. He could have just stepped back and put his hand on the child's forehead, this Baal-worshiping mother's child. But no, he gives all of himself. This ought to remind us of something. And then, like our Lord Jesus Christ, who stretched out his arms upon the cross, he brings forth life anew. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber of the house and delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, see, your son lives. And then the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth. Because here God is defined. There is an absolute morality. So it's not legalism. There is limitless grace. So there is law, there is truth, along with limitless grace. What this anticipates is what Paul says, there is no condemnation in Christ Jesus. Our God is not one who condemns. Our God is one who saves. And he comes to the marginalized, to all people. And he makes us marginalized so that we can identify with all people. And he pours himself out to them in love. Brothers and sisters, this is the true God of Israel. And if anyone from a political perspective is to invoke the true God, it's a false God unless it's this one. And if anyone is excluded, whether it be children or those from the old guard or those from the new, it is not the God of the Bible. So let's embrace this God anew as we come to the altar, the one who laid his life down for you, the one who was excluded from his grace, but now has included you. And with this love in mind, let us bring this God to all people.